The unexpected turn. Thomas Matthews stood in the grand office of his corner suite on the 38th floor of one of New York City's most prestigious financial firms. The skyline glittered around him, a constant reminder of the success he had painstakingly built over decades. At 45, he had reached the pinnacle of his career as a renowned financial advisor. He was well known for turning investments into fortunes and had clients from around the world. But lately, something gnawed at him, an emptiness that clung to him like a shadow. He had dedicated his life to his career, reaching the top with an unrelenting drive. But in the quiet moments, away from the stock markets, balance sheets, and endless deals, he felt the crushing weight of solitude. It wasn't something new. This feeling had begun creeping in over the last few years, but Thomas had buried it under more work, assuming success would eventually fill the void. But as he stood in his luxurious apartment, looking at the sterile furnishings and expensive art pieces, the loneliness felt louder than ever. "I've achieved everything they said I should want," he muttered under his breath, setting down his whiskey glass on the granite kitchen counter. The apartment was immaculate, spotless, yet soulless, much like his life felt at that moment. The walls echoed with silence. He had no partner to share his triumphs with, no children running through the halls. He had always told himself that marriage and family were things he would get around to eventually, but that eventually had never come. And now, in his mid-40s, the idea seemed more distant than ever. That night, as Thomas scrolled through his phone aimlessly, a headline popped up that made him pause. A record number of black children waiting for adoption in the U.S. It wasn't the first time he had come across an article like this, but for reasons he couldn't explain, this one struck a chord. He clicked on the article, and as he read, his chest tightened. The piece discussed the staggering number of children, especially older black kids, left in the foster care system, children deemed hard to place because of their age or skin color. They were often overlooked, unwanted. The article featured photos of several children, their faces filled with uncertainty and a silent plea for belonging. He stared at one boy's photo longer than the others. His name was Marcus, a 12-year-old with a somber gaze. The caption mentioned that Marcus had been waiting for a family for 6 years. 6 years. Thomas couldn't imagine what that felt like, to be passed over again and again, to wonder why no one wanted you. The thought haunted him for the rest of the night. As he lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to the faces in that article, particularly Marcus. Why was he so moved? Was it guilt? Compassion? Maybe both. But it was something more, an unfamiliar urge growing inside him, something bigger than the life he had built so far. The next morning, he found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, pondering the choices that had led him here. "I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth," he thought. But for what? The idea of adopting, of giving something back to the world in a more meaningful way, suddenly seemed not just noble but necessary. Still, doubt plagued him. Could he really do this? Was it too late for him to change the course of his life so drastically? And what did he know about parenting, let alone being a father to children who had already endured so much? For days, the thought lingered. He continued with his routine, meetings with high-profile clients, dinners at exclusive restaurants. But there was a growing disconnect between his external success and internal turmoil. His thoughts constantly drifted back to those children. Then, one evening, while sitting at his kitchen table, he made a decision. Thomas wasn't impulsive by nature. Every major move in his career had been meticulously calculated. But this time, it felt different. This decision came from a deeper place, something more intuitive. He picked up the phone and called a local adoption agency, inquiring about the children he had read about. The process wasn't easy. There were interviews, background checks, psychological evaluations. The agency was skeptical at first. A single, middle-aged man with no parenting experience wanting to adopt not just one, but several children. They had their doubts. But Thomas was relentless. He wanted to adopt children who were considered hard to place, the ones society had given up on. He made it clear that he was not interested in infants or young children, who were more likely to find homes. He wanted the older kids, the ones who had been in the system too long and were running out of time. The months that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and court proceedings. But eventually, Thomas was approved to adopt 7 siblings. They ranged in age from 9 to 17, all of them black, all of them having spent years bouncing from one foster home to another. Their names were Marcus, Jaden, twins Aliyah, and Amir, Jasmine, Deshawn, and the oldest Kayla. Each of them had a different story, but all shared a common thread. They had been abandoned, passed over, and overlooked by a system that was supposed to protect them. When the day finally came for Thomas to bring the children home, his heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. He wasn't naive. He knew this wouldn't be easy. These kids had endured trauma, loss, and disappointment. They wouldn't trust him right away, and he didn't expect them to. But he was determined to give them something they had never truly had, a home. As the children arrived at his apartment, which he had spent weeks childproofing and redecorating to make it feel less like a sterile bachelor pad and more like a home, the reality of what he had committed to hit him. Marcus, the boy whose photo had sparked this entire journey, was the first to walk through the door. His eyes were cautious, as if bracing for yet another letdown. The others followed, each carrying the weight of their past experiences. Thomas greeted them with a nervous smile, unsure of what to say or how to ease the tension. But Caleb, the oldest at 17, broke the silence. "So this is it, huh?" she said, her tone more curious than skeptical. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, this is home." For the first time in his life, Thomas Matthews realized that this moment, this decision, was bigger than any deal he had ever closed, bigger than any financial success he had achieved. He was no longer just Thomas Matthews, the financial advisor. He was now Thomas Matthews, a father. And as the children settled into their new surroundings, Thomas felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But what he didn't know was that the journey he had just begun would take him to places he never imagined. Places of love, loss, and redemption. And in 10 years, the way these children would repay him would leave him in tears and change the course of their family's future forever. This is just the beginning. The real test would come as they all navigated the complexities of their new life together. A journey that would challenge and change each of them in ways they could never foresee. Breaking down walls. The first night in their new home was one of cautious silence. Thomas had hoped there might be an ease to their transition, a kind of natural warmth that would fill the room, but reality was more complicated. The 7 children sat around the dinner table, their faces a mixture of fatigue and suspicion, unsure how to respond to the man who now stood as their legal guardian. Thomas, feeling the weight of the responsibility more than ever, carefully placed bowls of spaghetti in front of each child. He had read somewhere that spaghetti was a comfort food, easy to make and almost universally loved by children. But as the plates hit the table, the lack of enthusiasm was palpable. Marcus, the 12-year-old whose photo had first captured Thomas' attention, picked at his food in silence, his brow furrowed as if deep in thought. Kayla, the eldest at 17, kept her arms crossed, her body language a clear message: "Don't expect me to trust you." The twins, Aliyah and Amir, exchanged glances and whispered, while Jaden, the shy 9-year-old, seemed too overwhelmed to eat. Deshawn and Jasmine, 14 and 13 respectively, pushed their forks around without much interest. Thomas felt the tension thick in the air, but chose not to force anything. He didn't want to push too hard, knowing these kids had been through enough trauma to distrust any adult who claimed to care. So he let them eat in relative silence, making small talk where he could. He knew that earning their trust would take time. The next few weeks were filled with a rhythm of cautious routines. Each child had their own room now, something many of them had never had before. Thomas spent days redecorating, making sure each room reflected their personalities. He bought books, art supplies, and anything he thought would make them feel more at home. But no matter what he did, the emotional walls they had built remained firmly in place. Kayla, in particular, was a challenge. She was on the brink of adulthood, and years of disappointment had made her fiercely independent, mistrustful of any new authority figure. She rarely spoke to Thomas unless she had to, and when she did, it was often with an edge to her voice. "You don't have to pretend to care," she said one evening when Thomas asked how her day had gone. "We're just another project to you, right? Something to fix." The words stung more than Thomas cared to admit. He wasn't naive. He had expected resistance, but hearing it said out loud hurt. Kayla's mistrust cut deep, and though Thomas wanted to explain that this wasn't some temporary gesture, he knew he couldn't force her to see that. He would have to show her through actions, not words. The younger ones weren't much easier. Marcus was quiet and kept to himself, rarely engaging in conversation beyond a polite yes or no. Amir and Alia, the 11-year-old twins, were always whispering to each other, their bond with each other stronger than any connection they had with the outside world. Deshawn and Jasmine often argued over trivial things, the tension between them a manifestation of the frustrations they had carried from one foster home to the next. But Jaden, the youngest, was different. At just 9 years old, he was still young enough to be malleable, still open to the possibility of love. Though shy and quiet, he would sometimes sit beside Thomas while he watched TV, occasionally asking small, innocent questions. "Why did you pick us?" he once asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas had paused, unsure of how to answer. "Because I saw something special in you," he finally said, "and I knew I wanted to be part of your life." Jaden seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. He didn't say much after that, but he sat a little closer, a tiny step towards something like trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Thomas hope. The turning point came on a chilly autumn afternoon, about 3 months into their new life together. Thomas had taken the kids to a nearby park, hoping that some fresh air and a change of scenery might lighten the mood. It was a beautiful day, the trees vibrant with shades of orange and red, and the playground was bustling with children's laughter. Jaden ran off toward the swings, his face lighting up with a rare smile. The twins followed suit, while Marcus and Deshawn wandered over to a basketball court, dribbling a ball Thomas had bought them. Jasmine sat at a bench nearby, watching but not participating, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Kayla stayed back, leaning against a tree, her phone glued to her hand as usual. Thomas stood on the sidelines, watching them interact from a distance, trying to give them space while still being present. After a while, he noticed Marcus was sitting on the side of the basketball court, watching as a group of boys his age played a fast-paced game. It was then that something remarkable happened. One of the boys, a tall kid with curly hair, noticed Marcus sitting alone and called out to him, "Hey, you wanna play?" Marcus hesitated. He glanced at Thomas, as if seeking permission, though he didn't say anything. Thomas smiled and gave a small nod. "Go for it." Marcus stood slowly, still unsure, but eventually joined the game. The boy passed him the ball, and Marcus, despite his initial awkwardness, surprised everyone, including himself, with a smooth jump shot that went straight through the hoop. The boys cheered, slapping him on the back in approval, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus smiled. It was a small moment, but it was the first time Thomas had seen the boy truly engage with someone else since they had come to live with him. As the afternoon went on, the other kids started to relax as well. Alia and Amir joined a game of tag with some younger children, while Jaden swung so high on the swings that he nearly flew off, laughing uncontrollably. Even Jasmine, who had been so guarded, allowed herself to be coaxed into a game of hopscotch with some girls her age. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest as he watched them. For the first time since their adoption, he saw a glimpse of what they could become, a family. Not perfect, not without its struggles, but real. But the real breakthrough came later that evening, after they had returned home. They were sitting in the living room, still buzzing with the excitement from the park. Thomas had made popcorn, and they were watching a movie together, something they had never done before. It wasn't anything monumental, just a simple family moment, but in the context of everything they had been through, it felt huge. Toward the end of the night, Marcus surprised everyone by speaking up. "Thanks for today," he said quietly, not meeting Thomas' eyes but clearly addressing him. Thomas, taken aback, smiled softly. "You're welcome, Marcus." It was a small gesture, just 2 words, but they carried so much weight. It was the first real crack in the walls that Marcus had built around himself, and Thomas knew it was a sign of things to come. The others didn't say anything, but the mood in the room shifted ever so slightly. The tension that had been a constant presence in their home since they arrived seemed to lift, if only for a moment. That night, as Thomas sat alone after the kids had gone to bed, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. It wasn't easy, and he knew it wouldn't get easier anytime soon, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. These kids, with all their challenges and scars, were becoming his family, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, Thomas was ready to face it. He was no longer the man who had achieved everything only to feel empty inside. He was something more now, something greater. He was a father. The struggles of love and trust. The house had finally started to feel like a home. 3 months had passed since that day at the park, and while not everything had changed overnight, there had been subtle, yet significant, shifts. Thomas had begun to see cracks in the emotional armor the children wore so tightly. Marcus smiled more often. Jaden had grown more comfortable, and even Kayla, though still distant, had softened her edge ever so slightly. But with progress came new challenges. Thomas had always known that adopting 7 children, each with their own emotional baggage, wouldn't be easy. He had read every book he could find about adoption trauma, child psychology, and the complexities of building trust with kids who had been let down by so many adults before him. But theory and reality were 2 different beasts. One particularly hard morning came unexpectedly. It was a Monday, and Thomas had to return to work after taking some time off to focus on the kids' adjustment. He had prepared them for weeks, explaining that while he would still be present and involved, he had responsibilities outside of the home. Despite his best efforts to ease their anxiety, the morning felt like a test of everything they had built so far. Kayla, unsurprisingly, was the first to voice her frustration. "So, you're just leaving us like everyone else," she spat, her eyes filled with a familiar resentment. She stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, her stance defiant. Thomas could see the anger brewing beneath her tough exterior, the hurt she hadn't fully expressed. Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm not leaving, Kayla. I'll be at work during the day, but I'll be back every evening. This is temporary, just while I get things in order at the office." She scoffed, turning away from him. "That's what they all say. Temporary." Her voice cracked, betraying the wall she was trying to keep up. "Then they never come back." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Marcus stood by the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, watching the exchange silently. The younger kids were scattered around the living room, some pretending not to listen but clearly tuned into the tension. "Kayla," Thomas said gently, stepping closer to her but careful not to invade her space. "I'm not them. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, her eyes burning with years of disappointment. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more, might let him in. But instead, she turned and stormed off, leaving the kitchen in silence. Thomas stood there, his heart heavy, wondering if he'd ever be able to break through to her. Work was a blur. Thomas found himself distracted, unable to focus on the spreadsheets and meetings that once defined his existence. Every time he tried to concentrate, his thoughts drifted back to the house, to Kayla's face, to the worry he'd seen in the younger kids' eyes. He had left them in the care of a nanny, a kind woman named Mrs. Lopes who had experience working with children from the foster system. She had come highly recommended, and though the kids hadn't fully warmed up to her yet, Thomas trusted that she could handle things while he was away. But even with Mrs. Lopes there, Thomas felt uneasy. He knew that trust was fragile, especially for children who had seen so many adults walk in and out of their lives without warning. He had promised himself that he would be different, but today was the first real test of that promise, and it weighed on him more than he had anticipated. By the time he returned home that evening, the house was quieter than usual. The younger kids were watching TV, Jaden curled up on the couch next to Amir and Alia, while Marcus sat in the corner with a book. Mrs. Lopes greeted him at the door with a reassuring smile, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. "How are they?" Thomas asked, his voice low as he hung up his coat. Mrs. Lopes gave a soft sigh, a bit restless, but nothing too alarming. "Kayla was. Well, Kayla," she said gently, glancing toward the stairs. "She's in her room. Didn't come down for dinner." Thomas nodded, thanking Mrs. Lopes for her help before heading upstairs. His heart pounded as he stood outside Kayla's door, hesitating before knocking. He had no idea what to say, but he knew he couldn't just leave her up here, stewing in her anger and pain. The knock echoed softly through the hallway. "Kayla, can I come in?" Silence. He knocked again, a little more insistently this time. "I just want to talk." After what felt like an eternity, he heard the door unlock. Kayla opened it just a crack, her face half hidden. "What? Can I come in?" he asked again, his voice gentle, careful not to push too hard. She rolled her eyes but stepped back, allowing him to enter. Her room was neat, almost unnervingly so. The bed was made with military precision, her desk spotless except for a single notebook and pen. It reminded Thomas of his own apartment before the kids had come into his life, orderly, but empty. "Listen, Kayla," Thomas began, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I know today was hard, and I know you don't trust me yet, but I need you to understand something. I'm not leaving. I'm not going to disappear just because I have to go to work." She stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "That's what they all say," she murmured. "Every foster parent, every caseworker, they all promise they'll be there, but eventually, they get tired of us, of me." Her voice was bitter, but underneath it, Thomas could hear the hurt. Years of rejection had carved deep wounds in her, and she had built her defenses high to keep from being hurt again. Thomas had seen it before, in all of the kids to some degree, but with Kayla, it was particularly hard. She was the eldest, the one who had been let down the most. He stood and moved to her side, keeping a respectful distance. "I know I can't change what's happened to you. I can't undo the pain other people have caused. But I'm here now, and I'm staying. No matter how hard things get, I'm not going anywhere." She didn't respond for a long time, just stood there staring out the window. Thomas thought he might have lost her again, but then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack in the armor. "Okay," she said, so softly that Thomas barely heard her. Then she turned back toward him, her eyes still guarded but less hostile than before. "But don't make promises you can't keep." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "I won't," he said. "I promise." Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to shift. Thomas had found a better balance between his work and home life, making sure he was always there for the kids in the evenings, helping them with homework, making dinner, or just being present. The trust between them was fragile, but it was growing, bit by bit. One evening, Thomas came home to find Jasmine and Deshawn deep in conversation at the dining room table. They had always been at odds with each other, their sibling rivalry flaring up at the most random moments, but tonight was different. They were talking quietly, their voices low, and when Thomas entered the room, they looked up, surprised but not uncomfortable. "Hey," he said, smiling at them as he set down his briefcase. "What's going on here?" Jasmine shrugged. "Just talking." Thomas didn't press them, but he could feel the shift in the air. The walls between them were starting to crumble, even if only a little. The younger kids had their own small victories. Jaden, once shy and reserved, had started to open up more. He would sit with Thomas in the evenings, sometimes asking about his day, sometimes just sitting quietly, comfortable in the shared silence. Marcus, too, had started to engage more, joining in on family activities without being prompted. Amir and Aliyah, the inseparable twins, had always been a unit unto themselves, but even they had started to branch out. They joined a soccer team at school, something Thomas had encouraged, and seeing them run around the field, laughing and shouting with their teammates, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, they were starting to feel like they belonged somewhere. But for every step forward, there were setbacks. One night, Thomas heard a crash from Kayla's room, followed by a string of angry curses. He rushed upstairs to find her standing in the middle of the room, her notebook ripped apart, papers strewn everywhere. "Kayla, what happened?" She glared at him, her eyes wild with frustration. "It's nothing," she shouted. "Just leave me alone." Thomas hesitated, unsure whether to push or give her space. "I'm not leaving, Kayla. I'm here. Talk to me." For a moment, he thought she might lash out again. But then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she sank down onto the floor, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know why you even care." Thomas knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Because you're my family now, and I'll always care." She didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. And in that moment, Thomas knew they had made another small, but important, step toward becoming the family they both desperately wanted to believe in. Shadows of the past. Though progress had been made in the Matthews household, the past still lingered like a shadow over each of the children. Trauma has a way of resurfacing when least expected, and no matter how many good days they had, the bad days still loomed large. Each child carried their own set of invisible scars, and despite Thomas's best efforts, healing would require more than time. It would require the kind of patience and understanding that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined. It began subtly at first, small moments of tension that seemed to come out of nowhere. One day, Thomas found Marcus sitting on the back porch, staring off into the distance. It was unlike him. Marcus had been slowly coming out of his shell, but now he seemed distant again, lost in thought. When Thomas sat down beside him, Marcus didn't even acknowledge his presence. "You okay?" Thomas asked gently, careful not to pry. For a long time, Marcus didn't respond. Then, without turning his head, he muttered, "I don't know. Sometimes I just feel like none of this is real. Like you're not real." Thomas's heart tightened at the words. He had known this moment would come. The doubt, the fear that what they had built was nothing more than an illusion. "I get that," Thomas replied softly. "After everything you've been through, I don't blame you for feeling that way." Marcus finally looked at him, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. "What if one day you decide you don't want us anymore? What if you wake up and realize we're too much? Everyone else did." The rawness of Marcus's words hit Thomas hard. He had seen the toll that years of abandonment had taken on the boy, the fear of being unwanted, the constant expectation that one day everything would fall apart again. "I'm not going anywhere, Marcus," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I made a promise to all of you, and I don't break my promises. But I know it's hard to believe that, and I'm okay with proving it to you every single day." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, with a small nod, he turned his gaze back toward the trees. He didn't say anything more, but Thomas knew that the conversation wasn't over. It would never be over until Marcus could truly trust that this home, this family, wasn't temporary. Later that week, things took a darker turn. It was a Friday evening, and the kids were scattered around the house, enjoying their free time after a long week of school. Thomas was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he heard shouting from upstairs. His heart sank. Arguments between Deshawn and Jasmine had become a regular occurrence, and he had learned to pick up on the warning signs. He rushed upstairs to find the two of them standing in the hallway, faces flushed with anger. Jasmine had her hands on her hips, her body language screaming defiance, while Deshawn stood a few feet away, his fists clenched at his sides. "I hate you," Jasmine yelled, her voice sharp and trembling with rage. "You always ruin everything." Deshawn, his face twisted in frustration, shot back, "Maybe if you weren't such a brat, things wouldn't be so messed up around here." Thomas stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Whoa, what's going on here?" he asked, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "She's always blaming me for everything." Deshawn exploded, glaring at his sister. "Every time something goes wrong, it's my fault, even when it's not." "Because it is your fault," Jasmine retorted, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. "You don't even care about us. You just sit around being angry all the time." Thomas could see the pain behind both of their words. This wasn't just about the argument in front of him. It was about years of pent-up frustration and hurt. These two had been through so much together, and while their bond had once been strong, the weight of their shared trauma was tearing them apart. "Hey," Thomas said softly, his voice calm but firm. "Let's take a breath, okay? I know you're both upset, but yelling at each other isn't going to help." Jasmine wiped her eyes, her anger quickly turning into sadness. "He's always like this," she said, her voice quieter now. "He's always mad. I can't take it anymore." Deshawn looked down at his feet, his face still tight with frustration, but now tinged with guilt. He didn't say anything, but Thomas could see the shame creeping into his expression. Thomas knelt down so he could look them both in the eye. "Listen," he said gently, "I know things have been really hard for both of you, but you're in this together, okay? You're siblings. You've been through things that no one else can understand. You need each other." Neither of them responded, but the silence that followed wasn't the tense, angry silence from before. It was a silence filled with reflection, with the weight of what had just been said. After a few moments, Jasmine finally muttered, "I don't hate you, Deshawn. I just don't know how to deal with you sometimes." Deshawn shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. "Yeah, same." Thomas placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "It's okay to feel angry. It's okay to be frustrated. But we got to find a way to talk to each other without hurting each other, all right?" They both nodded, but Thomas knew it would take more than just a few words to heal the wounds between them. Still, it was a start. As the weeks went on, Thomas began to notice something strange happening with Kayla. She had always been the most guarded of the group, the one who kept her distance, both emotionally and physically. But now she was spending more time out of the house, more time than Thomas felt comfortable with. At first, he didn't say anything, not wanting to push her too hard. But when she started coming home later and later, and with a different attitude altogether, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, Kayla came home after dark, her face set in a mask of indifference. She walked past Thomas without saying a word, heading straight for the stairs. "Kayla," Thomas called after her, his voice calm but insistent. "We need to talk." She stopped on the third step, her back still turned to him. "I'm tired," she muttered. "I'll talk tomorrow." Thomas crossed his arms, not backing down. "We're talking now. Please." Kayla sighed dramatically and turned around, walking back down the stairs with the kind of exaggerated frustration that only a teenager could pull off. "What?" she asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. Thomas took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "You've been out a lot lately," he said. "I'm worried about you." Kayla rolled her eyes. "I'm fine. You don't need to worry about me." "It's my job to worry about you," Thomas replied. I'm not saying you can't go out, but you've been staying out later and later, and I don't even know where you are half the time." "So," Kayla snapped, "I'm almost 18. I can take care of myself." Thomas's heart sank at her words. It wasn't just the defiance that bothered him. It was the underlying belief that she was truly alone in the world, that she had to take care of herself because no one else would. "I know you're independent," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. You don't have to do this on your own." Kayla's eyes flickered with something, pain, maybe, or fear, but she quickly masked it with her usual defiance. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low. "You think you can just show up and fix everything, but you can't. I've been doing this by myself for years. I don't need you." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to remain steady. "I'm not trying to fix everything, Kayla. I'm just trying to be here for you. I want you to know that you don't have to carry everything on your own." For a moment, Kayla looked like she might say something more, something real, but then she turned away again. "I'm tired," she muttered, her voice cold once more. "I'm going to bed." Thomas watched her walk up the stairs, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew that breaking through to Kayla would be the hardest part of this journey. She had built walls so high and so thick that he wasn't sure if he would ever truly reach her, but he wasn't giving up. As the days passed, it became clear that each of the children was grappling with their own version of the same internal battle, learning how to trust, how to love, how to be loved. Marcus, with his quiet strength, still wrestled with the fear of abandonment. Jasmine and Dishon continued to clash, each of them struggling with how to navigate the complexities of their relationship as siblings who had been forced to grow up too fast. Amir and Alia, though seemingly carefree, carried their own silent worries, always fearing that the happiness they had found could be taken away in an instant. And Kayla remained the most distant, the most guarded, the most afraid of all. But Thomas had come to realize that love was not a cure-all. It didn't erase the past, and it couldn't magically heal wounds that had been festering for years. What it could do, however, was create a space for healing. A space where, no matter how hard things got, no one had to face their struggles alone. The breaking point. The Matthews household, though fragile at times, had managed to hold itself together through the small victories and shared moments of vulnerability. But as the months passed, the weight of the children's unspoken pain and their fear of being let down once again began to crack the foundation they had all worked so hard to build. Thomas, too, began to feel the strain. His patience, though vast, was not infinite, and the emotional toll of trying to hold everything together was beginning to show. It all came to a head one cold December night, when a seemingly minor disagreement escalated into the most difficult challenge the family had ever faced. It started like any other Friday evening. Thomas had picked up pizzas for the kids, hoping for a quiet night in after a particularly stressful week. Work had been piling up, and balancing his career with the needs of 7 teenagers wasn't getting any easier. The kids were spread out around the house, doing their own thing. Amir and Alia were playing video games, Dishon was watching TV, and Jasmine was upstairs working on homework. Marcus, as usual, had retreated to his room to read, while Kayla was nowhere to be found. Thomas glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m., and Kayla still hadn't come home. She had been growing more distant lately, staying out late and refusing to talk about where she had been. Thomas had confronted her more than once, but each time she'd shut him down with cold defiance, insisting she was old enough to make her own choices. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to the atmosphere in the house, a simmering tension that Thomas couldn't quite place. He tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself that everything was fine. But deep down, he knew better. The clock ticked past 10 p.m. Still no sign of Kayla. Thomas's worry began to morph into frustration. He tried texting her, but there was no response. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, his frustration had turned into full-blown anger. He paced the living room, glancing at his phone every few seconds, waiting for some sign that she was okay. Finally, At 11:30, the front door creaked open, and Kayla stepped inside, her face hidden beneath the hood of her jacket. She walked in as if nothing was out of the ordinary, as if she hadn't just been out past curfew without a word. "Kayla," Thomas said, his voice tight with restrained anger, "where have you been?" Kayla shrugged, not bothering to make eye contact. "Out," she muttered, her tone dripping with indifference. "Out where?" Thomas pressed, his voice rising. "I've been texting you for hours. You can't just disappear like that." She rolled her eyes. "I told you I'm fine. I don't need a babysitter. You might be almost 18, but you're still living under my roof," Thomas said, struggling to keep his composure. "I need to know where you are, and when you're coming home. You can't just. Why do you care so much?" Kayla snapped, cutting him off. "It's not like I'm your real daughter. You're not my dad, so stop pretending you are." The words hung in the air like a knife, sharp and cutting. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Thomas felt the wind knocked out of him. He had known this conversation was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the sheer brutality of Kayla's words. "I know I'm not your biological dad," Thomas said, his voice quieter now, but still firm. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. You're my daughter in every way that matters, Kayla." Kayla scoffed, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and hurt. "You don't get it. You think just because you adopted us, you can fix everything. But you can't. You don't know what it's like to feel unwanted, to have people walk out of your life like you're nothing." "I know I can't fix everything," Thomas replied, his voice shaking slightly now. "But I'm not walking out on you, Kayla. I'm here, and I'm staying." "Yeah, well, don't hold your breath," Kayla muttered, turning toward the stairs, "because I don't need you." The tension between Thomas and Kayla seemed to seep into every corner of the house in the days that followed. The other kids felt it too, especially Jasmine, who had always been closest to Kayla. Jasmine had tried to talk to her sister, but every attempt was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. Then, one night, the simmering conflict reached its boiling point. It was just after dinner, and the house was unusually quiet. Thomas was cleaning up in the kitchen when he heard the unmistakable sound of raised voices coming from the living room. At first, he thought it was just another typical sibling argument, but as he moved closer, he realized this was different. Kayla and Jasmine were standing in the middle of the room, shouting at each other. The rest of the kids were scattered around, watching in stunned silence. "You don't get to act like you're better than the rest of us," Kayla was yelling, her voice filled with a bitterness Thomas hadn't heard before. "Just because you're everyone's favorite doesn't mean you're perfect." "Favorite?" Jasmine shot back, her face flushed with anger. "What are you even talking about? You're the one who acts like she doesn't need anyone." "Because I don't," Kayla screamed, her voice cracking. "I don't need anyone." "That's not true, and you know it." Jasmine's voice softened, though her frustration was still evident. "You're just too scared to admit it." Kayla's face twisted in a mixture of anger and pain, and before anyone could react, she grabbed a glass from the coffee table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, sending shards flying in every direction. The room fell deathly silent. For a moment, no one moved. Thomas, heart pounding, rushed into the room, his mind racing. "Kayla," he shouted, his voice filled with both shock and concern. "What the hell are you doing?" Kayla stood there, breathing heavily, her face flushed with rage. But underneath the anger, Thomas could see something else, something much deeper. Fear, desperation, a plea for help that she didn't know how to voice. I don't need this," Kayla muttered, her voice shaking. "I'm leaving." Before anyone could stop her, she turned and stormed out the front door, slamming it behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. I didn't think she'd actually." "It's not your fault," Thomas said quickly, though his heart was racing. This has been building for a long time. Without another word, Thomas grabbed his coat and ran out the door after Kayla. The night air was cold and biting, but he barely felt it as he hurried down the street, searching for any sign of his daughter. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if she didn't come back? What if she got hurt? What if? He spotted her at the end of the block, walking quickly with her hood pulled up. "Kayla," he called out, but she didn't stop. He jogged to catch up with her, reaching out to gently grab her arm. "Let go of me," she shouted, yanking her arm away. But when she turned to face him, her eyes were filled with tears. "Kayla," Thomas said softly, his voice breaking. "Please, just talk to me." "I don't know how," she cried, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be part of a family." Thomas's heart shattered at her words. He stepped closer, but this time, he didn't reach for her. Instead, he spoke in the calmest, gentlest voice he could muster. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together. But you can't just run away every time it gets hard." Kayla wiped at her eyes, her face a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't know how to trust you," she whispered. "Every time I let someone in, they leave." "I'm not leaving," Thomas said firmly, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "No matter how hard this gets, I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Kayla just stood there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And then, slowly, she took a step toward Thomas. He opened his arms, and she hesitated for only a second before collapsing into his embrace, her tears soaking his jacket. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Thomas replied, holding her tightly. "But you're not alone anymore." Back at the house, the other kids had gathered in the living room, sitting in stunned silence after the outburst. Jasmine, guilt-ridden and upset, was curled up on the couch, staring at the broken glass on the floor. "I didn't mean to make her leave," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Deshaun, usually the most distant of the group, sat down beside her. "She'll come back," he said quietly. "Thomas will bring her back." And he was right. When Thomas and Kayla walked back through the door an hour later, the house was silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a new understanding, a new level of vulnerability that had been unlocked. The children looked at each other differently now, knowing that despite the anger, the fights, and the broken pieces, they were still a family. A fragile, imperfect family, but a family nonetheless. A gift of healing. The aftermath of that night left an indelible mark on the Matthews family. The air in the house had changed, not in the way that unresolved tension leaves a room heavy, but in the way that a storm clears out the suffocating humidity, leaving everything washed clean. The emotional explosion between Thomas and Kayla had been painful, no doubt, but it had also been necessary. It forced them all to confront the wounds they had been tiptoeing around for years, and it laid bare the truth that they were all still healing, each in their own way. Thomas stood in the kitchen the next morning, making breakfast like nothing monumental had happened the night before, but he could feel the difference. The kids were quieter than usual, their movements tentative as though they were testing the new atmosphere. The clatter of plates and the soft hum of the stove were the only sounds that filled the silence. Kayla came downstairs last, her eyes still red from the tears she had shed, but her face softer, more open. She didn't say anything, but she walked up to Thomas and gave him a small nod before sitting down at the table. It was her way of saying she wasn't ready to talk about it yet, but she was still here. She was still trying. Jasmine glanced at Kayla, guilt still evident in her eyes, but she didn't say anything either. Instead, she quietly handed Kayla a plate of pancakes, the smallest of olive branches. Kayla accepted it without a word, but the exchange held more meaning than anything either of them could have said. Thomas watched the quiet interaction, his heart swelling with cautious hope. Maybe they were going to be okay after all. In the weeks that followed, the family began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension that had once hung over them like a cloud began to dissipate. slowly but surely. There were still arguments, of course. 7 teenagers under one roof were bound to clash. But something had shifted. There was more openness now, a willingness to talk about the hard things, to face their fears and insecurities head-on, rather than burying them beneath layers of anger and defiance. Kayla, in particular, was starting to change. She was still guarded, still hesitant to trust fully, but she was no longer pushing everyone away. She started spending more time with the family, joining them for movie nights, and even opening up a bit to Jasmine again. There were moments when her walls would go back up, and she'd retreat into her old habits of isolation. But Thomas had learned to be patient. He understood now that healing wasn't linear, and that all he could do was continue showing up for her day after day. As the year wore on, Thomas found himself reflecting on how far they had come. It had been nearly a decade since he had first brought the children into his home, and yet it felt like a lifetime. He thought back to that moment in the adoption office, when he had first laid eyes on the 7 of them. So small, so scared, so utterly alone. He hadn't known then just how much they would change his life, how they would challenge him in ways he could never have imagined. But now, standing in his kitchen with the sounds of laughter and conversation floating in from the living room, he couldn't imagine his life any other way. It was a few days before Christmas when Thomas realized that something was up. The kids had been acting strangely all week, whispering among themselves and disappearing into their rooms for hours at a time. Normally, this kind of behavior would have set off alarm bells. After all, 7 teenagers plotting together rarely led to anything good. But there was a different energy in the house. It wasn't the usual mischief. It felt more purposeful. On Christmas Eve, Thomas came home from work to find the house unusually quiet. All the lights were off, save for the soft glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. He set his briefcase down and called out, "Hello? Is anyone home?" No answer. Thomas frowned, feeling the sudden pang of worry. He walked further into the house, his eyes scanning the darkened rooms. Just as he was about to head upstairs, the living room lights flickered on. And there, standing in front of the Christmas tree, were all 7 of his children, smiling nervously. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his confusion deepening. Deshaun stepped forward, holding something behind his back. We've been working on something. For you." Thomas's brow furrowed. "For me?" Deshaun nodded, and with a glance at his siblings, he pulled out a large handmade scrapbook from behind his back and handed it to Thomas. "We wanted to show you how much we appreciate everything you've done for us." Thomas took the scrapbook, his hands shaking slightly. He opened it to the first page, and immediately his breath caught in his throat. There, staring up at him, was a picture of all 7 kids from the day they were adopted. They were so small, so innocent, and yet their eyes held a sadness that Thomas remembered all too well. As he flipped through the pages, his heart swelled with emotion. The scrapbook was filled with photos, drawings, and handwritten notes from each of the kids. There were pictures from family vacations, birthdays, and holidays, moments that Thomas had treasured but never realized had meant just as much to them. Each page was a reminder of how far they had come as a family, how much they had grown together. Then he reached the section where each child had written a letter. The first one was from Aaliyah. "Dear Dad," it began, "I don't know how to put into words how much you mean to me. When you first adopted us, I didn't think anyone could love us the way you have. You've been more than a father. You've been our rock, our guide, our protector. I know I don't always show it, but I love you more than I can say. Thank you for never giving up on us." Thomas blinked back tears as he continued reading the letters from each of his children. Amir's was full of jokes, but beneath the humor was a deep gratitude that nearly broke Thomas's heart. Jasmine's letter was thoughtful and sincere, expressing how much she had come to see him as her real father. Deshaun, who had always been the quietest, wrote about how he had finally learned what it meant to trust someone. Marcus's letter was more reserved, but it was clear he had poured his heart into it. But it was Kayla's letter that undid him completely. "Dear Thomas," it began, "I never thought I'd be able to call anyone Dad again. When you first adopted us, I didn't trust you. I didn't trust anyone. I thought you would leave, just like everyone else. But you didn't. You stayed. Even when I pushed you away, you stayed. And that's when I realized something. I realized that love isn't about being perfect or never getting hurt. It's about staying, even when it's hard. I'm still learning how to be a part of this family. But I want you to know that I'm trying. And I love you. I just hope one day I can repay you for everything you've done." Thomas's hands trembled as he read the last line. He looked up at his children, all of them watching him with anxious expressions, waiting for his reaction. "You don't need to repay me," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've already given me more than I ever could have asked for." And then, for the first time in years, Thomas Matthews wept, not out of sadness or frustration, but out of pure, overwhelming love. He pulled each of his children into a hug, one by one, until they were all standing together in the living room, wrapped in each other's arms. In that moment, Thomas realized that the real gift his children had given him wasn't the scrapbook, or the letters, or even their gratitude. It was their trust, their love, their willingness to let him be their father, despite everything they had been through. That night, as they sat together in front of the Christmas tree, laughing and reminiscing about the memories they had shared, Thomas knew that they had finally become what he had always dreamed of: a family, a real family.